This hour of Hugh Hewitt starts right now on Salem News Channel.
Good morning, America. Duane Patterson in for Hugh Hewitt today. We are going to be discussing in this hour of the program what happened to America's education system, how it fell apart, and more importantly, how it can be recovered. Hugh's going to be dipping in and out of his interview with Christopher Rufo, author of America's Cultural Revolution. All straight ahead on the next hour of the Hugh Hewitt Show.
You won't want to miss a minute. This hour of Hugh Hewitt is on Salem News Channel. Portions of the following program may contain pre-recorded material.
Morning glory, America. Bonjour, hi, Canada. I'm Hugh Hewitt. I'm not there. I'm taking the grandkids to the airport. I'll keep the tears out of my eyes. I love the kids. I really do. And the Navy's sending them far away, so I won't see them for a long time. But I will get them to the airport on time, thanks to Duane, who's going to sit in for me today. And Chris Rufo stuck around with me on Friday talking about his book, America's Cultural Revolution, so we can play the rest of that conversation today, and Duane can keep you abreast of breaking news. Take it away, Generalissimo, and thank you.
Thank you, Hugh. It is Duane Patterson in for Hugh Hewitt all day today. And yes, we are going to be ducking in and out a lot of this interview that Hugh did last week with Christopher Rufo, who is the nation's foremost expert on education reform. And he's got a brand new book out called America's Cultural Revolution. We aired an hour of it last Thursday live, and then as soon as the program was over with, Hugh kept the tape rolling for another hour, and we're going to kind of work our way through that, because it doesn't just talk about how we got to where we're at. It talks about how to actually recover from that and start to reclaim some of the educational lapses that the right ceded ground to the left over the last several decades. So all that's going on. There is breaking news that's going on. Over the Sunday shows, the president's lawyer, John Lauro, did the full Ginsburg. And of course, if you don't remember what the full Ginsburg reference means, back in 1998, in the Bill Clinton administration, Monica Lewinsky was suing the former president, and her lawyer was William Ginsburg. And he did what was thought to be undoable at the time, which was appeared on all 5 Sunday shows the same day. He was on ABC's This Week, NBC's Meet the Press, CBS's Face the Nation. He was on Fox News Sunday and CNN's Sunday show, which now has become State of the Union. I'm not sure it was actually called State of the Union back then, but whatever their Sunday show, he was on it. There have been 26 different people in American politics that have done the full Ginsburg, and about 5 have done it twice. Believe it or not, Marco Rubio's pulled the hat trick. He's done the full Ginsburg 3 different times in his young political career. But John Lauro did the full Ginsburg over the weekend. We'll have, especially on the Grand Old Pod later on, we will do the Sunday roundup of all the political candidates and what they had to say. There's Ron DeSantis audio. There's an actuality from Tim Scott in there. Mike Pence made the rounds. Chris Christie was out. So you'll hear kind of all of that stuff on the Grand Old Pod, which is for members of the Huniverse, huniverse.com. But we need to get to at least the beginning of what you didn't hear from Christopher Rufo. This is Hugh Hewitt talking to Christopher Rufo, the author of America's Cultural Revolution.
Where I left off with Christopher Rufo was talking about the rise of critical race theory. And the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement, Christopher Rufo, took a lot of America by surprise. And I wrote in the Washington Post that, as you recount, the murder of George Floyd and the events preceding to that, Michael Brown, Jacob Blake, many other incidents, gave rise to this ferment. And then the murder of George Floyd was right in front of everyone. But you recount in the book, Black Lives Matter is based on a faulty premise that police violence resulting in death against unarmed black males is quite widespread. It's not. You bring the stats as told by my newspaper, the Washington Post. What are the statistics? And then let's work into the ideology that are based on false statistics.
Yeah, I mean, the statistics, in some ways, obviously any instance of especially an unjust police killing is a tragedy and should be handled by law enforcement. But most of the people who are killed by police are armed, dangerous, and in active confrontation with police officers. And if you look at the unarmed black men, which is the kind of key demographic for the Black Lives Matter narrative, you're looking at maybe slightly more than a dozen cases. But just because you're unarmed doesn't mean that you're not a threat in a year.
In 1 year.
Or a potentially a lethal threat. And so the numbers are not commensurate with the rhetoric, and the numbers, even such, again, because you're unarmed doesn't mean that you're not dangerous or potentially lethally dangerous. And so the number of unjustified shootings is even smaller than that in a large country with millions of police encounters per year. But the BLM movement, much like the Black Panther Party movement that was preceded it by half century, they both knew that this is the key rhetorical mechanism to gain power. And I found in my research the Black Panther Party memoirs, interviews, and other materials from the time period, from the 60s and 70s. They said very explicitly, we attempt to bait police officers in confrontation. They were running ambushes against police officers. They wanted to monitor and harass and intimidate police officers and stoke confrontation, because they believed that the violent confrontation with the police was their best recruiting tool. They said that very explicitly, and their best promotional tool. And so the narrative around police brutality, the narrative around confrontation with the police, the narrative around so-called disproportionate criminal justice sentencing and prison numbers has been part of that rhetorical toolkit since the very beginning. And while it may have felt new to many people in 2015 to 2020, it may have felt like fresh ideas, fresh language, fresh concepts. Everything down to the actual vocabulary was already fully developed by 1968. And in a sense, the radicals of BLM innovated, only in the means of communication using social media, et cetera. But Angela Davis and her colleagues had developed all of the concepts and all of the words that they used, all the slogans even that they used many, many decades before.
The incident is not mentioned in America's Cultural Revolution, but I first became aware of the ideological and violent inclination of Black Panthers when Alan Keyes was the tutor in Winthrop House in 1974 to 1978. Alan had to flee Cornell University with Alan Bloom because the Black Panthers took over Cornell University, and they threatened to kill any black on campus who was not of them. There was, and this has remained kind of a theme of every argument. You're with us or you're against us. And by with us, you're marching or you're not marching. You're with the police or you're with BLM. And that's given rise to a spiral down in race relations in America that I did not think possible. When Barack Obama was elected, I wrote a column saying, look, I'm not very happy with his politics, but the best thing is it's the fulfillment of the promise of Lincoln. It didn't turn out that way at all, Christopher Rufo. Was he captured, was his administration captured by CRT and the intellectuals that Angela Davis and Derek Bell birthed? And I'm going to come back to their opposition through those 40 years. But what happened? That was supposed to be the moment when America's racial reckoning had ended and we were to equality in fact as well as theory.
Yeah, it's really one of the kind of tragedies and a very disillusioning moment. Of course, I think everyone, Barack Obama had this soaring rhetoric. I don't think that Barack Obama was driven by this kind of radical politics. Yes, he had early connections with Bill Ayers. Yes, he had early connections with Derek Bell. But the way that he governed, the way that he had public rhetoric, it was, of course, on the left. It was, of course, on the left on healthcare and other issues. But I don't think that he was driven by CRT. But for a number of reasons, if you look at the public polling data from Pew, from Gallup, and others, there is what I call a racial retrograde that sits in around 2015 and accelerates into 2020. The public perception that race relations were good, that opportunity was available, that things were getting better on racial issues, reaches a kind of high point in American life, and then just collapses towards the end of Barack Obama's second term, and then further collapses, of course, throughout Trump's first term. And so this is, in my view, the great tragedy. I think so many people on left and right had a moment of hope, felt like we could maybe get beyond some of those entrenched conflicts. Turned out not to be true. And I think it's in part because the left itself became extremely disillusioned with President Obama. really, no one on the radical left, including Barack Obama's old mentor, Derek Bell, who was the godfather of CRT, towards the end of his life, in I think 2010, he gave a speech as an elderly man, and he said, Barack Obama, my former mentee at Harvard Law School, is in a sense a black president of a white supremacist country. And so actually, it wasn't a symbol of progress. It was a symbol of bitterness, that he was a symbol that presided over a fundamentally rotten country. And that's the narrative that really prevailed.
We will get to more of this interview with Hugh and America's Cultural Revolution author Christopher Rufo right after the break and in the segments ahead. Duane Patterson in for Hugh Hewitt. Stick around. We'll be back right after the break. Portions of the Hugh Hewitt Show are brought to you by Food for the Poor. Welcome back, America. 22 minutes past the hour. Duane Patterson in for Hugh Hewitt today. We'll get back to the interview with Hugh and Christopher Rufo, author of America's Cultural Revolution, in just a second. Education reform is going to undergird the entire program today. 12 hours ago, Joe Biden tweeted out, "It's time American public school teachers got a raise." I agree. Here's the problem. Corey DeAngelis, a colleague, a compatriot of Christopher Rufo, tweets, or X's, or whatever we do these days, "Where's all the money going?" Because if you actually look at where the money has gone, we have given 152% of funding. Funding has gone up 152% from 1970 to 2018. And if you actually look at teachers' salaries, they've gone up about 8%, where the funding's gone up 152%. So where's all that extra money going? It's going to the unions. It's going to places it's going towards woke programs. It's going to all sorts of places you don't want it to go. That's what Alec is here to help fix. The American Legislative Exchange Council. They have the rich state, poor state map. It looks at every state and ranks them based upon taxes and regulatory costs and all sorts of actual measures of what makes a state a good spot to uproot and move to or move and flee from. But one of the things they do best is network with state legislatures. Twice a year, we just did this in Orlando a couple of weeks ago. Twice a year, they meet with the movers and shakers of state governments, and they work on all sorts of policy issues and actual innovative issues, like school reform. Go to richstatespoorstates.org, richstatespoorstates.org now, and learn more about Alec, because that is an organization you probably have never heard of before, but they're one of the most powerful organizations out there, and they could use your support. We'll get back to education reform in a minute. I also need to talk to you about what's going on in Central and South America. The predictions are that we're going to have a massive hurricane season. I don't know if there is or if there isn't. But the one thing I do know is our friends at Food for the Poor are pre-staging relief in case the storms hit, which is actually a pretty novel approach and a smart thing to do. Here's Carla to talk about what we're doing and partnering with different places in Central and South America.
Because El Salvador ranks as one of the top 10 most vulnerable countries worldwide. So the well-being of the most vulnerable population is always threatened on a yearly basis. We understand this is going to be a recurrent problem in El Salvador. So having your support gives us a lot of confidence that we can face struggles and support this vulnerable population without delays.
$100 provides emergency kits like tarps, first aid, hygiene supplies, blankets. If you can afford it, $240 throws in a week's worth of food and water. And you can help. All you have to do is go to hughhewitt.com, click on the emergency relief supplies banner at the top, let it load, it'll eventually load. Or you can just text Hugh to 91999. That's Hugh to 91999. Or just pick up the phone and give the best gift you can give to 855-359-4673. That's 855-359-HOPE. Help us assist the poorest of the poor with your most generous gift today to Food for the Poor. And finally, this segment, I got to do my Relief Factor because Hugh's not here to do the Relief Factor for you. He has now shipped off the grandkids. He is now trying to recover from lifting and doing the clean jerk of the grandkids over his head. This is something where Relief Factor makes a difference in his life to let him play with the grandkids and not be completely catatonic the next day. Icarian resveratrol, omega, and curcumin, the four magic ingredients, all blended together in easy-to-swallow pills. $19.95 is a starter pack. You should try it. Hugh has done it for years. It works for him. He swears by it. It'll work for you, too. Go to relieffactor.com, that's relieffactor.com, and get your starter pack today. We will come back after the break. Christopher Rufo and Hugh Hewitt will pick up where they left off. They're still kind of diving into what got us to where we're at. with the education decay that's going on in the country, and more importantly, what's upcoming is how to get it back, how to restore your faith in your child's education, whether it is getting them out of the public education system, talking to school boards, whatever's necessary. That's what's discussed straight ahead, upcoming on the Hugh Hewitt Show. Oh, we still have a minute left. Okay, let me play you one quick clip. Let's play cut number one. Here's what's going on in California to combat you trying to fight back at school boards. Listen to this. Cut one.
This bill redefines in California statute what harassment is. So they've redefined it to say, and I will read it to you word for word. Harassment means a knowing and willful course of conduct directed at a specific person that seriously alarms, torments, annoys, or harasses or terrorizes the person and serves no legitimate purpose.
This is a former California state senator who is outlining a bill in California that would make going to school board meetings tormenting the public officials and make it against the law, criminalizing it. It's crazy, but this is California. More from Christopher Rufo and Hugh Hewitt right after the break. Duane Patterson in for Hugh Hewitt. Stick around. Portions of the Hugh Hewitt Show are brought to you in part by the American Legislative Exchange Council. Visit alec.org for more info. Out cues. Thursday, the part you didn't hear on air with Christopher Rufo, author of America's Cultural Revolution.
I want people to know that Christopher Rufo is relentlessly honest in this record. So, for example, Derek Bell, Harvard Law School's first black professor, is opposed among black intellectuals by liberals like H. Lewis Gates and Randall Kennedy and conservatives like Thomas Sowell and Justice Thomas. But Derek Bell is a story unto himself. It's an epic story. It's a tragedy, actually, what Derek Bell does, because he's a man of great physical courage, some intellectual accomplishment. He was not a scholar, and I'm not a scholar. I'm a good teacher. I don't know if Derek Bell was a good teacher. I teach con law, but I don't spend my days in the stacks. I don't do books like this. This is a work of scholarship. How do you explain Derek Bell's movement? Because we're moving here from Marcuse to Angela Davis. Next is Derek Bell. We'll come back to Paulo Freire. But who is Derek Bell? Why does he matter so much, Christopher?
Yeah, Derek Bell is a pivotal figure, and he is the godfather of critical race theory. The discipline of CRT was established by his students and by his mentees and the circle around him at Harvard Law School. And he's famous because he became the first black full-time law professor at Harvard. And but his story begins with the point of optimism and then goes through this period of disillusionment. He becomes a civil rights lawyer after serving in the Air Force, after gaining a position at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. He actually goes down to the Deep South and files these desegregation cases on behalf of black residents in these really poor cities and towns around the South. He has immense courage, as you said, physical courage even. He oversees 300 desegregation cases against significant opposition, against threats to his safety, against a lot of pressure down south. And he really, in a kind of noble way, helps so many of these families gain better access to education. But then he goes through this period where he actually turns against the desegregation movement, against Brown versus Board. He says that it doesn't do what it's supposed to do. It doesn't accomplish what it's supposed to accomplish. And he develops this theory of racial pessimism, where that he developed over time at Harvard Law, in which he describes every instance of what he views as supposed racial progress as a smokescreen, as an illusion, as a mechanism of manipulation and control. And so he gets to the point where he says that Lincoln and the Emancipation Proclamation and the 14th Amendment were really to serve corporate interests, not to liberate blacks from slavery and oppression. He says that in the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was merely a way for the white power structure to make its racial domination more subtle, more complex, more insidious. And then, of course, as I mentioned, he says that even the election of Barack Obama was a way to put a symbol of African American, the African American community that actually served to entrench again those kind of white interests or white power structure. And so in every turn, he becomes the idealist in his youth that goes to a cynic in his middle age. And towards the end, he's a nihilist. I mean, he really sees no hope of progress. He says that we're on the verge of what he calls a black genocide in the United States. And he says in one of his famous stories or parables that white Americans would actually sell or trade the entire black population of the United States to aliens from outer space in order to banish them from Earth. I mean, his view becomes so dark, so cynical, so pessimistic. And then paradoxically, at the same time, he becomes even more famous, more well-recognized, more influential, and more powerful. And so it's this really sad confluence of incentives that led him to this point of no return in his thinking. And then, of course, in my view, paradoxically, but certainly in an ironic way, his pessimism yields this great influence and is essential for the founding of critical race theory.
I don't know if you made this point explicitly. He's very much a Moses figure for the crits. And I say that he got to almost to the promised land. He saw it, but he did not enter in. When I went to law school in 1980 to 83, there were no crits, none, at the University of Michigan Law School, one of the top 5 law schools in the country. I don't believe there were any at Stanford or Yale. The crits were at Harvard. And you didn't when I entered into the business of being part of the appointments committee at Chapman Law School in the early years when I chaired it. I didn't want anything to do with the crits because they had a capacity to destroy faculty relationship because they were so aggressive. The crits now run the academy, the legal academy. And so Derek Bell didn't see it coming because he saw people like Randall Kennedy not going with him. But at the same time, like a second meteor heading towards the Intellectual University of America, Paulo Freire, I hope I'm saying his name right, is rocketing towards our education establishment, even as Derek Bell is heading into, in influence and students, our legal establishment. Let's pause and go off the Derek Bell path for a moment to talk about Paulo. Tell me how to say his name. I honestly didn't know a thing about him until I read your book.
Yeah, it's Paulo Freire, and he's a very interesting figure because he's almost totally unknown, but he is a kind of hidden master or hidden influence behind all of our education policy. And so Paulo Freire was born in Recife, Brazil. He became a kind of Marxist in Brazil. He became a kind of revolutionary pedagogist, meaning a theoretician of education. He was banished from Brazil after a military coup. He traveled around the third world, trying to work with communist movements to establish their education programs. He was actually a visiting scholar for a short stretch at Harvard, of course, overlapping very slightly with Derek Bell in the late 1960s. And then Paulo Freire, by kind of against all odds or all expectation, becomes the most influential person in educational theory in the United States. He's actually the third most cited author in all of the social sciences in the United States. He has the most assigned text for graduate schools of education that train our K through 12 teachers. And so he's had a profound influence. And the real irony, though, with Paulo Freire, something that I was shocked by once I dug into the details and really into the archival research, is that Paulo Freire served as a pedagogist and really a propagandist for Marxist-Leninist revolutionary governments in the Third World. And in particular, he was given kind of full reign over designing the educational program in a small country called Guinea-Bissau on Africa's west coast as their Marxist-Leninist kind of educational guru. And, he had these great theories that are now influential in American K-12 schools, but when he actually had the chance to put them into practice in this country, Guinea-Bissau, the researchers who looked into the archives in Guinea-Bissau at the actual statistical outcomes discovered that he didn't teach anyone how to read. His great educational theory that was put in power had no capacity to teach people even basic literacy. And so this kind of terrible, terrible irony is that what Paulo Freire failed to do in the Third World, which was teach literacy, American teachers and graduate school professors are now trying to embed in the United States. And so, one thing that I saw over and over in all of the stories that I tell in the book is that these folks start with this great idealism. They implement their ideas, and they invariably yield disaster. I mean, over and over and over, they simply don't work. And in my view, if you're a educational theorist and your theories are not able to teach people even how to read at a basic, rudimentary level, it's time to try something different. And unfortunately, in the United States, we're really hurtling straight forward into this Paulo Freire's world.
Well, I am a bit of an optimist after reading America's Cultural Revolution about turning the tide, and we'll come back to that. But I want to borrow an actual historical example from the tragedy of the Native American experience in America, the Trail of Tears. As I follow Paulo Freire's career, it's not just Guinea-Bissau. I mean, he goes on to ruin education throughout the Third World, with it Mozambique and other places. He's just a failure wherever he goes because, Christopher, what I don't understand, we all know it doesn't work. Marxism, no matter what you call it, no matter how you dress it up, it never worked. It just yields tragedy, pain, and sorrow. And he is the walking, talking emblem of that because you follow his career. You're very fair-minded. He went from here to here. And by the way, you point out, he was in danger of his life in Brazil. They wanted to kill him. They threw him in jail for a while. Again, there's trauma at the bottom of every leftist, I've begun to believe. There's just deep disassociation from love. They have no love, no hope in the human soul, and they try and engineer love in through this crazy theory. But he's just he's worse than Che. I mean, at least Castro got Cuba under his control and ran it as a police state. Lenin got the Soviet Union. Mao got China. These two get nothing. Che and Paulo, they're like the world's worst revolutionaries.
I know, and it is so fascinating because in a sense, countries of the third world should be looking to the developed nations and the nations with very high literacy rates and figuring out what those nations are doing and then replicating or copying or learning from those theories. But in fact, the opposite process has occurred, that the advanced, high literacy, industrialized Western nations are looking to the third world Marxist backwater regimes and then taking their educational theories and then implanting them in the United States. But Paulo Freire had a very interesting concept that I think is worth exploring, and I think there's actually some value to it. He talks about the third world in the first world. And what he means by this is that he looks at the American underclass, the American inner city, the American ghetto populations, and he describes them as kind of small third world enclaves within the larger first world context of the United States. And although I think his prescriptions are wrong, in some sense he's documenting a very real process, a very real relationship, and something which neither liberals nor conservatives have really satisfactorily answered. This question of what is that relationship, how can one improve conditions, and until conservatives are able to do that and demonstrate results and demonstrate a better path, I'm afraid that demagogues like Paulo Freire will have a deep appeal to people. And although he may be offering bad ideas, in a sense, there is a vacuum. There is no alternative that the right has produced that has anything like the magnetic power of Paulo Freire.
More from the Christopher Rufo interview with Hugh Hewitt straight ahead. It's fascinating to me listening and watching, if you're watching on the Salem News Channel, watching this interview and seeing what the left has done to the education arena over the last few decades. I'm reading a piece in the New York Times today that kind of coincides with this that is fascinating. More on that after the break. Duane Patterson in for Hugh Hewitt. You'll be stunned to see what the New York Times reported today. Stick around right after the break. Portions of the Hugh Hewitt Show are brought to you in part by Birch Gold Group. A little Jacob Dylan and the Wallflowers. Welcome back, America. Good call, Adam. Jacob Dylan, by the way, one of the people that's going to be at the Crossroads Guitar Festival upcoming on my birthday at Crypto Arena in L.A. I get to go see that concert with Eric Clapton and a whole bunch of guitarists I like. It's time for the market report. Before we get back to the interview with Christopher Rufo and Hugh, I want to quickly do a market report. And as always, our market report is brought to you by our friends at Birch Gold, where you can go to birchgold.com. You can text Hugh to 989898 and get a free info kit on gold IRAs and whether it's right for you to have a tax-sheltered retirement account backed by physical precious metals. Historically, gold has been a safe haven in times of uncertainty, and boy, are we in times of uncertainty. The news today, the yellow trucking industry, the freight carrier that you've seen on the side of the road all over the country for decades, 99-year-old company, they're done. They're gone. They had a $700 million pandemic loan 3 years ago. 2.5 years ago, and it wasn't enough to salvage them. They filed bankrupt, and they're not just reorganizing, they're pretty much done. They closed the doors. 30,000 jobs are going to be lost just from that one company alone, 22,000 of them Teamsters. The market right now, it's green in pre-trading. It's up. Everything's up. Dow's up 36 points in pre-trading. S&P's up about 10. NASDAQ's up about 54 right now. So far the market's shaking off the kind of the impending doom that seems to be heading towards the economy as the impact of yellow freight going under. And there's also another story out today that is of interest to me, and that is that, yes, inflation is cooling, writes the Wall Street Journal, but food inflation certainly could get worse. Food prices have been rising rapidly for longer than central bankers had expected, and recent setbacks may prolong the agony. Now, you see where I come from. I'm a simple person. When you talk to me about inflation, I think of, okay, well, inflation is how much does it cost to live somewhere, how much does it cost to eat, and how much does it cost to put gas in my tank? That's how I measure inflation. And when I hear people in papers tell me inflation is cooling, which means it's getting easier, it's not getting out of control quite as bad as it was, yet food inflation is going up through the roof, that's inflation to me. And so I don't know. If you're kind of uncertain about where the economic conditions are, you may want to invest a little bit of your portfolio in gold. Learn more at Birch Gold by going to texting Hugh to 989898. Get the free info kit. Learn about it. See if it's something that works for you. And then, as long as you're talking about food inflation, that's what myphdweightloss.com. That's another added benefit because I'm not eating as much food as I once did, and it's actually okay to not eat as much food. I've actually become accustomed to not eating as much food. I lost 50 pounds over the course of 12 weeks, and I've been able to keep it off for a year. 864-644-1900 is where you go to learn about My PhD Weight Loss, or you can go to myphdweightloss.com. 864-644-1900. No pills, no drugs, nothing crazy. It's just a tried and true plan. It's mostly learning how to eat the right kind of foods, avoiding other kinds of foods, and talking to a counselor, talking to a nutritionist every week to stay accountable and to kind of refine it so that you pick a program that works best for you. I mean, I had a counselor that worked on a very bizarre meal schedule for me, working overnights here on the West Coast. And it worked. I lost the weight, and I've been able to keep it off. It'll work for you, too. 864-644-1900. Coming up after the break, we're going to get back into the interview with Christopher Rufo and Hugh Hewitt, talking about, the progressive left and what they've done to the education system for 50 years. There is a truly amazing, stunning story that's in the New York Times over the weekend. I think it appeared actually on Saturday. It's by Mara Vistendahl, David Farenthold, Lindsay Chutel, and Ishan Javeri. It's titled, A Global Web of Chinese Propaganda Leads to a U.S. Tech Mogul. And I'm going to work my way through this story in the snippets of time I have in and around the interview with Christopher Rufo, because even though it's not necessarily directly education related, you're going to understand the parallel here, because what's happened with the progressive left to the education system, we're seeing Chinese influence of these progressive groups in all sorts of better policy arenas here in the United States today, and how destructive it is. And it's stunning to me, number one, to read the depth of it, and two, it's in the New York Times that they're reporting this. Stick around. Lots of news ahead, lots of education reform talk with Christopher Rufo. All straight ahead, next hour of the Hugh Hewitt Show. Duane Patterson in for Hugh Hewitt today. Hugh's going to be back tomorrow, but he's still kind of here today. Stick around. We'll come right back after the top of the hour. Portions of the Hugh Hewitt Show are brought to you in part by Birch Gold Group.
This hour of Hugh Hewitt starts right now on Salem News Channel.
Good morning, America. Duane Patterson in for Hugh Hewitt today. We are going to be discussing in this hour of the program what happened to America's education system, how it fell apart, and more importantly, how it can be recovered. Hugh's going to be dipping in and out of his interview with Christopher Rufo, author of America's Cultural Revolution. All straight ahead on the next hour of the Hugh Hewitt Show.
You won't want to miss a minute. This hour of Hugh Hewitt is on Salem News Channel. Portions of the following program may contain pre-recorded material.
Morning glory, America. Bonjour, hi, Canada. I'm Hugh Hewitt. I'm not there. I'm taking the grandkids to the airport. I'll keep the tears out of my eyes. I love the kids. I really do. And the Navy's sending them far away, so I won't see them for a long time. But I will get them to the airport on time, thanks to Duane, who's going to sit in for me today. And Chris Rufo stuck around with me on Friday talking about his book, America's Cultural Revolution, so we can play the rest of that conversation today, and Duane can keep you abreast of breaking news. Take it away, General Lissimo, and thank you.
Thanks, Hugh. Morning glory, everybody. Duane Patterson in for Hugh Hewitt today. Let me quickly reset what we're doing today. On one silo, one track, we are playing back the rest of the interview that Hugh conducted last Thursday with Christopher Rufo, America's preeminent expert on education reform, has written a brand new book called America's Cultural Revolution, which is the absolute go-to place of how we got to where we're at with the education decay and morass that we face ourselves with right now, and more importantly, how to recover it and get it back. We're going to get to that in just a second. Second silo, there is a piece out of the New York Times today which you need to go read. A global web of Chinese propaganda leads to a U.S. tech mogul. Lots of the same actors, lots of the same characters, a lot of the same Marxist and communist influences that you heard so far in the Hugh interview with Rufo that you're going to read in this New York Times story. First, let's get back to the interview with Hugh.
When we come towards the end of this to talk about solutions, and we talk about the Hillsdale College charter schools and about various things like that, we'll discuss that. But I want to pause for a moment on CHAZ, because this is not a remote threat for people. We have a couple of, you detail not only CHAZ, but the Portland, just the nightmares that have occurred on the West Coast, where theories of revolutionary CRT and DEI have taken root and been tried out. Let's start with CHAZ. What's that stand for? Again, the neighborhood, the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone. What happened there, and remind people about what happened at CHAZ.
Yeah, CHAZ is quite interesting. And, I live in the Seattle area, and so I actually reported on the ground at CHAZ for City Journal. And this was this moment during the George Floyd summer where activists and anti-police activists and Black Lives Matter protesters surrounded and the Seattle's Capitol Hill police station. The police defended the police station with barricades. They went through multiple nights of this conflict, bottles, rocks, brass knuckles, tear gas. I mean, it was really hand-to-hand kind of trench combat. And then the mayor of Seattle at the time, Jenny Durkin, made the decision to abandon the East Precinct Police Department and essentially give it over to the rioters. And what happened next was quite interesting. It's actually reminiscent of the Paris Commune. But what happened is that these BLM activists took over not just the East Precinct Police Department, but they actually took over this huge section of the Capitol Hill neighborhood. They established barricades. They established an autonomous zone. The police stood down. They were not policing this area. And they declared essentially an independent republic inside the city of Seattle. They said it was going to be horizontal, governed without hierarchy in these great general assemblies where the community would set the standards. Of course, just like the Paris Commune before it, just like many of these utopian experiments, it ended in kind of tyranny. You had the very strong warlord, a guy named Raz Simone, who was pictured unloading AR-15s from the back of a white Tesla, passing them out to his group of kind of mercenary thugs, and then beating up anyone who would resist his rule. They had the homeless community put tents up all around the CHAZ, and so it was quickly taken over by vagrants. Their trash was piling up, and then it all ended because it started to become a kind of murder zone. Multiple individuals, including a minor, were murdered in the CHAZ. Police were unable to respond because they couldn't gain access to the zone. And then for a time, it actually had a homicide rate that was 50 times greater than that of Chicago. So it was actually the most deadly neighborhood in the United States during its short-lived rule. And
it
so
would be amusing were it not tragic.
Symbol.
You detail, there's a little hippie element, right? They wanted Woodstock at CHAZ. They thought they were going to sell beads and tie-dye shirts, and they got wiped out. They just got rolled over by the guys with guns.
They wanted Woodstock and they ended up with Baghdad. I mean, it's quite a stunning reversal. And I think it's a perfect symbol, though, is that the authority abdicated responsibility. The radicals established their utopian community based on their own view of human nature, their own view of ideal politics. And then within 3 weeks, it collapses and ends in disaster, ends in bloodshed. And of course, this was all done in the names of Black Lives Matter. But among those who were actually killed in the autonomous zone were some young Black men. And so it really, I thought, was the perfect symbol for 2020. And just like many Americans have forgotten about what happened with Angela Davis in the Marin courthouse seizure, I think many Americans have already, just a few years later, forgotten about the details of that Capitol Hill autonomous zone. I wanted to go back into it, rely on my reporting, show the kind of up close and personal look at what happened, so that we're not, so that we don't fall victim to this great amnesia that seems to happen, where the left tries one of its ideas.
There's a beautiful bit of art, and this book is very well constructed, Christopher. My hat is off to you for America's Cultural Revolution, because side by side with CHAZ, we have the descent of Portland and Antifa into chaos. And that's in the urban center where there's already crime and difficulty to go, side by side with Tigard and the school district of the upper middle class Anglo people. And they're both subject to revolution. One is violent and one is ideologically determinative and totalitarian, but doesn't use violence. Can you explain both how the city of Portland inner city and the Portland suburbs both succumb, not just to Paulo and Derek Bell, but to people like Noel Ignatieff, who I've never heard of, and who wrote White Blind Spot, and Henry Giroux. They're a bunch of people. This is their plan. They're winning.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, of course, what was happening in the streets of Portland, actually now dating back many years, particularly through the reporting of Andy No, has been widespread. Everyone knows about the Antifa riots, the kind of firebombing of the federal courthouse in Portland. They take over the streets. They wear all black. They intimidate any kind of journalists or opposition figures that happen to get in their way. That was a story that had been really told and exposed over the last couple of years. But there's a hidden story in Portland, and then also even in the suburbs of surrounding Portland, that those ideas that you see activated in the street are actually embedded in the K through 12 curriculum. And so the chapter on Portland in the book is called The Child Soldiers of Portland, because activist teachers whom I have exposed through original source reporting, whistleblower testimony, parents who've now gone on the record and told me what's happening, sifting through the documents from the curricula, they're taking revolutionary principles. They're embedding it into the K through 12 school system, and they're teaching kids starting at a very young age how to be left-wing revolutionaries. And then the teachers are doing things, one of the anecdotes in Portland schools that I thought was so horrifying is that the DEI leaders, the people who are supposed to be championing diversity and inclusion, were actually conducting not only white privilege seminars or kind of white fragility seminars, but actually one of these teachers who was a DEI leader would subject her colleagues, her white colleagues, predominantly white female colleagues, to 90-second hate sessions. And so they would allow these teachers, these kind of so-called BIPOC or racial minority teachers, to just scream and yell at white teachers about how they were oppressive, about how they were evil, about how they were doing everything wrong. And they would have 90 seconds to kind of vent their frustrations and scream epithets at these teachers solely because of their racial categories. And so that is the culture in Portland area public schools. And so it's really no surprise that many of these kids end up in the streets, throwing bricks and throwing incendiary devices at police officers just a few years later.
We will get back to more with Hugh Hewitt and Christopher Rufo after the break. I have been teasing you about this New York Times story. Remember this name. Write down this name. Neville Roy Singham, Singham. We're going to learn more about who this guy is and the impact he's had on American culture and the progressive left through his benefactor work. And you're going to be stunned to read to hear and watch not only what he has done, but what he espouses and the influences in that have led to the groups he has given money to. It's amazing what's in the New York Times this morning. We'll get to that, I promise you, in the next break. And then, in the bottom of the hour, we'll continue along with the Christopher Rufo interview. Duane Patterson in for Hugh Hewitt. Stick around. Lots ahead today. Portions of the Hugh Hewitt Show are brought to you in part by AmericansForProsperity.org. 22 minutes past the hour. Welcome back, everybody. Duane Patterson in for Hugh Hewitt today. Just checking the weather forecast, actually the hurricane forecast. The NOAA has updated their weather forecast for the hurricane season 2023, even though they're saying that it's kind of quiet out there. You know, the traditional seasons from June 1st to the end of November. And there was 3 or 4 early named storms, nothing really too big or dramatic, but some early stuff. But it's kind of quiet out there right now. They're tracing what they were calling waves, but they're not really bubbles yet that are even going to turn into storms necessarily. But that doesn't mean that it can't balloon in a hurry. They're still predicting up to 13, 15, a couple agencies are predicting 18 named storms, including some major ones. It still could happen. We don't know. What we do know is that Food for the Poor is preparing in case there is. They are pre-staging relief right now in Central and South America, and they can only do that with your help. If you go to hughhewitt.com, and click on the Emergency Relief Supplies banner at the top of the page, you can help out by donating $100, and that will provide emergency kits, which include tarps, first aid kits, hygiene supplies, blankets. And if you can really help out and donate $240, you get those same emergency kits, but you also can donate a week's worth of food and water. And they're placing these assets now ahead of time before the storms get there so that when the need arises, the help can be immediate and you can take part in that. Go to hughhewitt.com, click on that banner at the top of the page, or you can text Hugh to 91999. That's texting Hugh to 91999, or the old-fashioned way. You can phone 855-359-4673. That's 855-359-HOPE. Help the U.S. assist the poorest of the poor with your generous gift today to Food for the Poor. Now, I got to get to this New York Times story. The protest in London's bustling Chinatown brought together a variety of activist groups to oppose a rise in anti-Asian hate crimes. So it was peculiar when a street brawl broke out among mostly ethnic Chinese demonstrators. Witnesses said the fight in November 21 started with men aligned with the event's organizers, including a group called No Cold War, but they attacked activists supporting the democracy movement in Hong Kong. On the surface, No Cold War is a loose collective run mostly by American and British activists who say the West's rhetoric against China has distracted from issues like climate change and racial injustice. In fact, the New York Times investigation found it is part of a lavishly funded influence campaign that defends China and pushes its propaganda. At the center is a charismatic American millionaire, Neville Roy Singham, who is known as a socialist benefactor of far-left causes. What is less known and is hidden amid a triangle of nonprofit groups and shell companies is that Mr. Singham works closely with the Chinese government media machine and is financing its propaganda worldwide. From a think tank in Massachusetts to an event space in Manhattan, from a political party in South Africa to news organizations in India and Brazil, the Times tracked hundreds of millions of dollars to groups linked to Mr. Singham that mix progressive advocacy with Chinese government talking points. Some, like No Cold War, popped up in recent years. Others, like the American anti-war group Code Pink. You remember seeing them, right? They have morphed over time. Code Pink once criticized China's rights record, but now defends its internment of the predominantly Muslim Uyghurs, which human rights experts have labeled a crime against humanity. These groups are funded through American nonprofits, flush with at least $275 million in donations. But Mr. Singham, 69, himself sits in Shanghai, where one outlet in his network is co-producing a YouTube show financed in part by the city's propaganda department. 2 others are working with a Chinese university to, quote, spread China's voice to the world, end quote. And last month, Mr. Singham joined a Communist Party workshop about promoting the party internationally. I'm going to get to a lot more of this story because when you start to read the web and all the money in the shell companies and how it's untangled, it's, again, when you hear the education reform stuff and how we got to that, these are the same progressives that are doing the same things to other parts of American culture. It's enough to give you a headache, which Relief Factor won't cure. But what Relief Factor will do is take care of those daily aches and pains that you have. They have taken care of Hugh's daily aches and pains, and he's talked about it every day for the last, 10, 15 years or so. ReliefFactor.com, the 1995 starter pack, the inflation-proof starter pack. It hasn't gone up in price in several years. Icarian, resveratrol, omega, and curcumin, the 4 magic ingredients blended perfectly in easy-to-swallow pills. $19.95 is a starter pack. It works for Hugh. It'll work for you as well. ReliefFactor.com is where you go to get the starter pack. ReliefFactor.com. At least give it a try. Try it out for a couple of months, 6 weeks, 8 weeks. See if it does the same thing for you that it does for Hugh. Coming up after the break, we'll dive back into the education tranche of the program today as Hugh continues with Christopher Rufo. Duane Patterson in for Hugh. We'll be back right after the break. Portions of the Hugh Hewitt Show are brought to you by Food for the Poor. Welcome back, America. Duane Patterson in for Hugh Hewitt today. Hugh will be back tomorrow. Coming up after the break, I'll get back into this New York Times expose of Neville Roy Singham. But as promised, here is more of Hugh's interview from last Thursday with the author of America's Cultural Revolution, the look at what the progressive left has done to America's education system, with Christopher Rufo. Here's Hugh.
There is an ancestry to this ideology. And in the public school realm, it begins in the city of San Diego. Not surprisingly, Herbert Marcuse is a professor at the University of San Diego. Angela Davis studied with him there. And Christopher, you can take us back. We're going backwards now from Portland to the genesis of the corruption of the ideals of public education in America. It's all California-based. It starts in San Diego. It moves into the core curriculum of California. You chart it. Then it moves up the coast. Now it's everywhere. I think it's basically a plague, and far worse than COVID. And it's gone everywhere. And I don't know how we're going to remedy it. We'll talk about remedies in a minute. But let's detail how it moved. And it started, I believe, in the city of San Diego.
Yeah, I mean, it really is a California phenomenon. And the irony here that still strikes me, and I was born and raised in California. I know California very well. But the irony is that you had, of course, Ronald Reagan. You had Richard Nixon. The kind of seminal figures of post-World War II conservatism were both, from California. And yet at the same time that they were winning electoral majorities, the radicals were establishing institutional dominance. And they knew very early on that they had to take over the K through 12 schools, that they had to take over the formation of the curriculum, and that they had to really change how kids think in order to change the future trajectory of the state and then the country. And they're remarkably successful in doing so. All of these trends that I've highlighted, the trends on, whether it's the Black Panther Party in the early section, whether it is, critical race theory 50 years later, whether it's, Paulo Freire's radical pedagogy, all of these ideas, almost all of them you can see in the lineage and the documentation first take root in California, first take root in Portland, Oregon, first take root in Seattle, Washington. And so there's something about the left coast where I still live today, where all of these ideas first take root here, and then they conquer the territory back east. And I'm afraid that conservatives, and look, the conservative movement is really a kind of East Coast phenomenon as far as the kind of elite conservative institutional movement. I look at my friends and colleagues on the East Coast and I say, you guys have no idea what's coming. I think being based in the West Coast has given me kind of a 10-year head start. Observing what's happening now in these cities and states, I kind of have a window into the future, what some of my East Coast colleagues will see, years down the line.
Christopher, I lived in California from 89 after the Reagan administration through to 2016 when I moved back to the Beltway. And my kids went to public schools and they had great education. It's before the core curriculum was adopted. As you say, the ethnic studies model curriculum was not yet in place. And so now it's everywhere. They weren't in city of San Diego schools. They were further to the north and in a school district populated by a heavily Asian American immigrant community insisting on STEM. I mean, STEM was it. So it was sort of the most well-defensed against the idiocy, the moral and intellectual idiocy of Paulo Freire. But it's crumbling. And I want to pause to make sure we also talk about the takeover of the federal bureaucracy. My last job in the Reagan administration was as the acting director of the United States Office of Personnel Management. I got confirmed at a very young age because everyone else had left. OPM was not radical in 1980. It wasn't competent. God knows it wasn't competent. We couldn't fire anyone. We couldn't get security clearances done. But it was not ideological. You describe a federal bureaucracy today that is manifestly ideological. And I've never believed in a deep state. But now you've got me thinking on America's cultural evolution that I'm simply blind to what's going on in the DEI bureaucracies of the federal government. How deep is the problem?
Oh, I mean, it's extremely deep, and it reaches really the highest levels of the management of these departments. And you have to understand, first and foremost, and this is kind of common knowledge among conservatives, that these federal departments, if you look at education, environment, justice, labor, et cetera, are uniformly left wing. You can measure it in rough terms, by political donations, it's like 95% to 5% Democrats to Republicans. I think that's an indicator of the kind of culture. But then what happens is that the kind of DEI departments, DEI trainers, DEI leaders have used those structures to impose a very extreme left-wing ideology on these departments. I did a lot of reporting during the Trump administration on this, and I talked to a lot of sources within these departments that said, they're in a sense committing a kind of soft purge against any remaining conservatives within these departments, making life so miserable that they retire, resign, or they're discouraged from entering the civil service in the first place. And so, when I hear about deep state, the problem with the term deep state is that it suggests an organized conspiracy, that there is a cabal of people throughout the government that are conspiring to do X, Y, and Z. I don't believe that. I don't see a kind of hard evidence that would persuade me that that's true. What this is actually a decentralized cultural system, a system of incentives, a system of ideological priorities that is not enforced by a conspiracy, but it's enforced by becoming the social norms within these institutions. And so when you have institutions where the norms are uniformly left-wing, where the bureaucracy incentivizes that way of thinking, where the DEI system rewards employees for promoting those kind of ideas and discourages employees who might oppose them, you don't actually need a deep state because you have what Gramsci called cultural hegemony, that even people's way of thinking is already determined by those patterns. And so I'm not a kind of deep state conspiracist, but I think that you can say without any doubt that there's a system of ideas and incentives that have become entrenched by the mechanism of norms and the reproduction of norms that puts conservatives at just a tremendous disadvantage. And I think there's an argument to be made that it actually threatens the constitutional structure of our system, because if you have a bureaucracy that refuses to do what a conservative president instructs it to do, you have a constitutional problem that I don't think has been successfully resolved.
One former Trump cabinet secretary told me off the record that they learned the hard way that the first thing you have to do is fire as many people as you can at the highest levels or move them out. Just warehouse them, because you've got to bring in people who will follow the direction of the people's will. I also got to say, it's very evident to me, combining my experience with your book, that if you get tenure and then you graft ideology onto tenure, that's the dangerous combination. It's not a conspiracy. The public employee unions got tenure. They established the Merit Systems Protection Board. They established what teachers unions have across the country. You cannot fire anyone. It's not worth the lift. It takes too much time and energy. Then you capture the culture after you've captured the contract. And then you've got what you talk about, cultural hegemony. Now let's bring us to the radical agenda before we go to the solution. I want people to understand this doesn't stop here. There is for example, a UCLA law professor you cite on page 261, Cheryl Harris, who has written in the Harvard Law Review that private property is the problem. Now, there is no free society in the world that is not built on property rights. It's why I pray this Supreme Court that Trump got in place before he was run out of town by the collective, not a conspiracy, but by the combination of his own bad judgment and the collective, that the assault on property rights has got to be stopped by the Supreme Court, even as they stop the use of race. At least they've got to try, because she is just very upfront about it, as the intellectuals often are. They want to end it. They want to take it.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, and Cheryl Harris is, of course, one of the founders of critical race theory, and then one of the things that I learned in my reporting and then in the research of the book is I said, all right, well, okay, critical race theory, it's a critique of American society. Okay, I get that. It's a critique of what they see as systemic racism. All right, this is kind of common knowledge. But then you say, well, what do these folks actually want? What are they proposing that we do? And one of the key policy proposals by Cheryl Harris, writing, of course, in the Harvard Law Review, a very public venue, is that she says, kind of whiteness is entrenched as a form of property. And in order to reduce the kind of nature or the hold of systemic whiteness, you must reduce the hold on private property. You must kind of suspend private property rights, redistribute property. And she actually says in this paper that a model to follow is South Africa and the African decolonial countries. Which of course has not worked well there. It's a different historical context, but again, you have the kind of the permanent reinvention of the old Marxist idea. If you take away private property, you're going to have a better society. I suppose in theory, yes, I suppose in theory, in the abstract, there's an argument for it. But it seems like historical experience is never a deterrent to these folks. They don't look at any of the societies where they've abolished private property. And it always ends in the most kind of blood-soaked tyranny. Economic, and this is a good point, I think, because you have a kind of an audience that straddles both camps. But there's a strain of conservative thinking on the kind of a little bit kind of Reaganite kind of right wing that says that the culture war, is kind of it's a dirty business. We shouldn't get involved. We should focus mostly on economic concerns. We should focus on tax policy, welfare reform, entitlements, et cetera. The kind of Paul Ryan wing of the conservative movement that is not interested in fighting these cultural fights. But I think that it's important for those folks on our side to understand these cultural fights are merely a mechanism or a tool set for them to take ownership over private property, for them to take the economic terms. And so I think that you have to understand the culture war in terms of the ultimate prize for these folks. They want to use these kind of culture war rhetoric and policies and institutional dominance in order to ultimately not just kind of cast aside the Constitution, but to actually cast aside capitalism, which they view as the ultimate evil. And so I think it's short-sighted for our friends on the kind of Paul Ryan style right to not get involved in these cultural fights, because ultimately, they're not going to be protected either, and those economic systems are not going to inevitably continue if these kind of cultural patterns and ideas are firmly embedded in all of our institutions.
Just a couple of minutes ago, you heard Christopher Rufo talk about the Marxist influence and wanting to follow the South African model. The story I've been reading in the New York Times today, Mr. Singham, Neville Roy Singham, the billionaire benefactor of all things communist Chinese, includes a foray into South Africa. We'll cover that after the break. Duane Patterson in for Hugh Hewitt. Also, more ahead from the Christopher Rufo interview. Lots going on today's program. Stick around. We'll be back after the break. Welcome back, everybody. Duane Patterson in for Hugh Hewitt today. Just scanning the headlines. You know, if you were an investor, and I were to tell you 2 days before the U.S. made the policy of releasing oil out of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, if you had that information 2 days ahead of time that we were going to make that move, could you make a buck or two off of that? If you had that kind of insider information? Well, apparently, according to Fox News, they have reported and released never before knowledge that Energy Secretary Jennifer Granholm actually met with her Chinese counterpart, the head of Sinopec, the Chinese oil company run by the CCP. She met with the lead person there twice, on October 19th and October 21st of 2021. Now, keep in mind, this is after 9 months of Bidenomics. This is 9 months of inflation. This is 9 months of gas prices climbing over $1 a gallon from where they started with the Biden administration. And she had private meetings with the head of the Chinese energy company. And then 2 days later, presto, we released oil from the SPR. Who bought it all up, or who bought a good chunk of it up? The Chinese, Sinopec. Now, at the time, guess who was still a financial investor in Sinopec? That would be Hunter Biden and Devon Archer. They hadn't divested themselves of BHR partners. They had a financial stake in Sinopec. Remember, back in 2014, Hunter Biden flew on Air Force Two with Joe Biden to go visit his people at Sinopec and came up with the investment firm to be able to invest in it. The whole thing is crooked. But here's the good thing. People are learning about it, and there are solutions to energy independence. There are solutions to all this. That's what Americans for Prosperity does. Write down this website, prosperityispossible.com. prosperityispossible.com. What is Americans for Prosperity doing? They're mobilizing the grassroots army of freedom-loving, concerned citizens like you and me all summer long. They're holding events all over the country. And they're not just rallying folks against the Bidenomics that made everything more expensive and curbing energy production and everything that you know is wrong. They are actually helping unleash energy abundance right here in America. They're empowering the American workforce by cutting red tape of government overregulation. They're doing all sorts of things and proposing all sorts of solutions, which you can learn at AFP's Prosperity is Possible tour. Go to prosperityispossible.com and be part of the solution to Bidenomics. Find an event near you and go to prosperityispossible.com. Now, you heard Christopher Rufo in the last segment talk about the South Africa model and the nexus and their role in American education decay. Back to this New York Times story and Neville Roy Singham, the benefactor of American progressivism. Several times a year, activists and politicians from across Africa fly to South Africa for boot camps at the Nkrumah School, set in a popular safari area. They come to learn to organize workers and left-wing movements. Once on campus, though, some attendees are surprised to find Chinese topics seeping into the curriculum. At a recent session, reading packets said that the United States was waging a hybrid war against China by distorting information about Hong Kong, Taiwan, and the Xinjiang region where Uyghurs were held in camps. The packets praised Chinese loans, calling them an opportunity for African states to construct genuine and sovereign development projects, the Belt and Road Program. No mention was made of China's role to a recent debt crisis in Zambia. They're being rounded up to be fed Chinese propaganda, said Sebalil Mabusisa, a former employee who helped prepare materials for the workshop. Whole social movements on the African continent are being hijacked by what looks like a foreign policy instrument of the CCP. Those who objected were shouted down and not invited back, 4 past attendees said. U.S. tax records show that one of the UPS store nonprofits, the People's Support Foundation, donated at least $450,000 for his training at the school. And on Instagram, Ms. Evans, that would be Jody Evans, the founder of Code Pink and the wife of Mr. Singham, she described a photo of the grounds as, quote, Roy's new place. The $450,000 was just part of Mr. Singham's efforts in South Africa. In all, the foundation has sent $5.6 million to groups that run the school, a news organization, and the Socialist Revolutionary Workers' Party, a fringe party launched ahead of the 2019 election. So he's meddling in South African politics as well. It's just, there is an insidious network going on, and if you don't see the parallels between this and what Christopher Rufo and Hugh are talking about just on the education subject, then you're not drawing the dots you should be drawing, because they are very closely connected. Coming up at the top of the hour, we'll continue along with the interview with Hugh and Chris Rufo. Stick around. Duane Patterson in for Hugh Hewitt. More right ahead. Portions of the Hugh Hewitt Show are brought to you in part by AmericansForProsperity.org.
This hour of Hugh Hewitt starts right now on Salem News Channel.
Good morning, America. Duane Patterson in for Hugh Hewitt today. We are going to be discussing in this hour of the program what happened to America's education system, how it fell apart, and more importantly, how it can be recovered. Hugh's going to be dipping in and out of his interview with Christopher Rufo, author of America's Cultural Revolution, all straight ahead on the next hour of the Hugh Hewitt Show.
You won't want to miss a minute. This hour of Hugh Hewitt is on Salem News Channel. Portions of the following program may contain pre-recorded material.
Morning glory, America. Bonjour. Hi, Canada. I'm Hugh Hewitt. I'm not there. I'm taking the grandkids to the airport. I'll keep the tears out of my eyes. I love the kids. I really do. And the Navy's sending them far away, so I won't see them for a long time. But I will get them to the airport on time, thanks to Duane, who's going to sit in for me today. And Chris Rufo stuck around with me on Friday talking about his book, America's Cultural Revolution, so we can play the rest of that conversation today, and Duane can keep you abreast of breaking news. Take it away, Generalissimo, and thank you.
Thank you, Hugh. Duane Patterson in for Hugh Hewitt. I see over at the Atlantic on X right now that they're dinging our friend Christopher Rufo. They seem to think that he doesn't understand what universities are for. They're supposed to be for celebrating the radicals and the nut jobs. That's what universities do best. And they're trying to take their pound of flesh out of Christopher Rufo. Whereas for the last couple hours or so, you've been hearing and watching Christopher Rufo and Hugh go through and bring the receipts of actually who destroyed American education, how it happened, when it happened, why it happened, and more importantly, how to recover it and get it back. And that's the part of the interview we're at now. We rejoin Hugh and Christopher Rufo talking about America's cultural revolution. Let's get back to the interview.
Chris Rufo, you really do know my audience. We do bridge. We bridge the Reagan optimist and the Paul Ryan economic freedom is first, but we thought we won. We thought we beat the Soviets. We thought we won. And then over here with the cultural concern, I've always been a pro-lifer. That battle goes on, but we thought we won with Dobbs, and it turns out, they're not going away. The people of abortion on demand are not going away. But I've always known that we lost the schools, and now I see some glimmers of hope out there, and I want to talk about this. Blob the movie. Did you ever see it? The old Steve McQueen classic in black and white. The blob just keeps growing until you freeze it.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So how do we freeze this? We're moving now to what do we do, not what is the problem. Anyone who doesn't have enough of a glimpse of the problem is going to find out when they see Johnny or Jane or Sarah or anybody's homework. They're going to see the problem. And I've heard it in my grandchildren's conversation. The public education system is broken, and it's broken for two reasons: tenure, and it's easier to be a CRT teacher than it is to teach algebra. It just is. Do you agree with me about that? It's just easier. You can't measure the success of a CRT teacher. You can measure whether or not a kid can do an algebraic equation. And so public employee unions that don't want performance management are going to love CRT. So how do we combat this, Chris Rufo?
Yeah, well, this is actually a very bright spot, and I'm actually very optimistic about the future of American education for two reasons. One is that conservatives have to pursue two strategies simultaneously. The first is actually get involved in school board politics. We've seen this in tremendous parent movement after CRT, after COVID lockdowns, after all the gender madness that has gotten in schools. Conservative parents are now getting organized. They're mobilizing. They're winning school board elections. They're taking over responsibility over their local institutions. That recapturing is an essential part of the solution moving forward. And the second element, and here I'm even in a sense more optimistic, is that conservatives have been fighting for school choice for 60 years, more or less. But for the very first time in that 60-year fight, with Governor Doug Ducey in Arizona, who's a wonderful leader, they got universal school choice. And now I think it's now 6 or maybe even 7 states, depending on how you count them. And universal school choice is a very simple program. It says that if you as a parent are not satisfied with your public school, you can take approximately $7,500 per year per child and take it to any educational venue of your choice. Charter school, private school, religious school, homeschool, micro school, alternative school. So parents are now empowered with their money. They can take their tax dollars and they can now provide those tax dollars to alternatives. And this does two things. One, it benefits the parent directly. Obviously, you can take your kid and put him in a school that reflects your values. But it also actually shifts money out of the public school system and into the private market. And that creates the supply side, creates the demand to actually increase the supply of educational options. And the third thing that I'm really optimistic about, and I'm actually a participant in this with my own children who are, 1, 5, and 12. There is the fastest growing facet of American K-12 education right now is the classical school movement. So going back to teaching Greeks, Romans, Renaissance, American founding, logic, grammar, rhetoric, Latin, all of the kind of old, great classical liberal arts subjects, and doing it with an eye towards cultivating virtue, cultivating kind of religious tradition in many of these schools. And this is fast growing because it offers a kind of antidote to the secular corruption that you see in CRT, that you see in gender ideology. And so parents are opting into these new classical schools. And so I think conservatives are on the cusp of actually a kind of a renaissance in education because so many parents have finally woken up to these ideologies that have captured the institutions. And so I'm very optimistic, and policymakers, parents, local school boards, there seems to be just an incredible energy behind this. And I see it every day as a policy scholar, but also as a parent.
Christopher, after I finished America's Cultural Revolution, I read Intellectuals by Paul Johnson, but I also reread American Caesar by Manchester because I had recalled he did have a chapter, and I found it, about turning movements, flanking movements, the great one, Inchon being the most recent one, where you simply go around the mass forces of the opponent. Hannibal did it in the Punic Wars. Napoleon was a genius at Robert E. Lee used Stonewall Jackson that way at Chancellorsville. And we're not in physical combat, but we are in an intellectual struggle. And rather than try and take over school boards, the flanking movement is what you just described. Arizona, Iowa, Ohio, West Virginia, Florida, Arkansas, there's one more, and we need other places, and they need to work well. This is the important part. They cannot, Arizona had a cyber breach, and the new Democratic governor is exploiting it at the behest of the teacher unions to try and discredit this. What is the most important thing, do you think, in terms of quality? Because if you have a counter-revolution and it fails, they kill all the counter-revolutionaries. I mean, it's not a good thing to be on the losing side of a counter-revolution. What is the crucial thing here? I think it's talent and brains, but I'll leave it up to you to decide.
Yeah, I think talent and brains is part of it, but I actually think that there's a structural component that is really important to understand. And what school choice is doing in Arizona, it's doing in other states now, is creating a constituency and creating a patronage network and creating a group with vested interest that is aligned and reinforces that system. And so what I mean by that is that Arizona now is, I think now, something like $900 million are going towards these school choice vouchers or school choice scholarships, whatever you want to call them. And so you're actually providing money to parents who then enroll their kids in private education, who enroll their kids in these religious schools, who enroll their kids in homeschool programs. And now they're bought into the system. And if the left tries to take that away, they're going to fight it furiously with everything they have. And so I know that, total free market conservatives kind of grimace when they hear creating patronage, creating interest groups. But what more important interest group is there if we're going to have a public education system, if we're going to pay taxes for education? Why are we going to give all of our money to the teachers union when we could actually give money to individual parents and families and have them choose and then create an interest group that supports schools that reflect our values? And so I think it's democratic. And of course, the inventor of this approach was Milton Friedman, not exactly a statist, kind of a free market guy himself. But I think it's actually important to say, if there is a large state budget, conservatives need to actually start thinking of, well, how can we move some of that money towards programs and people and patronage relationships that actually advance our values, that protect our voters, that help people that are aligned philosophically. And I think this is a big shift that we're seeing.
We will conclude the interview with Hugh and Christopher Rufo in just a little bit. And I will come back after the break and dip back into this New York Times piece, which shifts away from the education issue and goes into the breadth and depth that the CCP has become involved with co-opting the American progressive movement through the work of Neville Roy Singham. And I don't even know what's more staggering about this story in the New York Times, whether it's just how pervasive the CCP is in taking over the progressive movement here in the United States, or the fact that it's in the New York Times and reporting it. Both are kind of shocking, actually. We'll get to more of that coming up after the break, plus a whole lot more. And by the way, if you want all the political news, we will have that in the Grand Old Pod, which is for subscribers to the Huniverse, Huniverse.com. Things about Republicans, by Republicans, for Republicans. We will do all the campaign stuff coming up in the Hour 4 section, only at the Universe. Duane Patterson in for Hugh Hewitt. We'll be back right after this. Portions of the Hugh Hewitt Show are brought to you by Food for the Poor. Speaking of land of confusion, Duane Patterson in for Hugh Hewitt. I was watching the highlights of the World Cup, and you got to give Megan Rapinoe credit where credit's due. The whole world is watching soccer. The whole world is watching whether or not the U.S. women's team can make it out of this round of the World Cup. And on the biggest stage of her career, Megan Rapinoe had a penalty shot, and she was not thinking about soccer. She wasn't playing soccer. She was trying out to be the Cleveland Browns place kicker. Hey, you got to give her credit. The form was good. I mean, that would have been an extra point in any stadium. I mean, it was straight. It would have gone right through the uprights. But sadly, her career is over with. The U.S. women's team is done with the World Cup. But don't shed any tears for Megan Rapinoe. I am quite convinced that ESPN will sign her as a color commentator in about 4 seconds. She'll land on her feet, which is better than the rest of the team might end up. But anyway, yeah, I saw it. That was the news over the weekend. That's about the length of what I care about the U.S. women's national soccer team. But yes, I did see the news. Back to what we need to talk about. And that is the hurricane season that is underway. Now, last year, there was not a whole lot of hurricanes, at least tropical storms or anything in the early part of the season. And then there was a real cluster of them all in a hurry. Well, this season seems to be mirroring last season, at least thus far. All's quiet on the Eastern Front, if you will, but that could change overnight. And Food for the Poor is not taking anything for granted. They are staging all sorts of relief efforts just in case the storms do hit. Here is one of the people that Food for the Poor is partnering with in, I think, Guatemala. This is Carla.
Because El Salvador ranks as one of the top 10 most vulnerable countries worldwide. So the well-being of the most vulnerable population is always threatened on a yearly basis. We understand this is going to be a recurrent problem in El Salvador. So having your support gives us a lot of confidence that we can face struggles and support this vulnerable population without delays.
Carla is actually in El Salvador, but Food for the Poor is pre-staging relief efforts in Jamaica, Guatemala, and all sorts of places where they are normally prone to get really hammered when a bad storm hits. You can help out too, because you can make a difference in a bunch of kids' lives at a time when they're really going to need it. All you have to do is go to Hewitt.com and click at the emergency relief banner once you let it load at the top of the page. Or text Hugh to 91999. And look, $100 is all it takes to provide an emergency kit. It's got hygiene supplies, blankets, first aid kits, tarps. If you kick in $240, you'll get that emergency kit plus a week's worth of food and water. And you can put it in place so that when the storms hit, there's no delay. The relief gets there immediately, and you save kids' lives. Text Hugh to 91999 or pick up the phone and call 855-359-4673. That's 855-359-HOPE. Help us assist the poorest of the poor with your most generous gift today for Food for the Poor. I want to get back to this New York Times story. And then we're going to go after the break back to the conclusion of the Christopher Rufo interview. Mr. Singham says he does not work at the direction of the Chinese government, the New York Times writes, but the line between him and the propaganda apparatus is so blurry that he shares office space, and his groups share staff members with a company whose goal it is to educate foreigners about, quote, the miracles that China has created on the world stage, end quote. Years of research have shown how disinformation, both homegrown and foreign-backed, influences mainstream conservative discourse. Mr. Singham's network shows what that process looks like on the left. He and his allies are on the front line of what the Communist Party officials call a, quote, smokeless war. Under the rule of Xi Jinping, China has expanded state media operations, teamed up with overseas outlets, and cultivated foreign influencers. The goal is to disguise propaganda as independent content. Mr. Singham's groups have produced YouTube videos that together racked up millions of views. Speaking of social influencers, they also seek to influence real-world politics by meeting with congressional aides, training politicians in Africa, running candidates in South African elections, and organizing protests like the one in London that erupted into violence. It's pretty insidious and pretty detailed, and it's a pretty long expose. Here's one thing that you don't have to do an expose of because it's all out there in the open, and that is the 4 magic ingredients of ReliefFactor.com that help out Hugh every day. Resveratrol, omega, curcumin, and Icarian are the 4 ingredients. That's all that's ever been in there. That's all that ever will be in there. Everybody knows they reduce inflammation. If you mix them in the right dose and you get it into your system over the course of several weeks, it will reduce the inflammation that causes the daily aches and pains that come with aging and exercise. It has helped you. It will help you as well. All you have to do is go to ReliefFactor.com. It's a $19.95 starter pack. That price hasn't gone up. It's a loss leader. They lose money on every starter pack because they know it works. If you just try it, you'll come back and get more. ReliefFactor.com. Get your starter pack today. ReliefFactor.com. We'll be back with Christopher Rufo and Hugh Hewitt concluding the interview on America's Cultural Revolution right after the break. Duane in for Hugh. Be back in a sec. Welcome back, America. Duane Patterson in for Hugh Hewitt. Hugh will be back tomorrow. Most of the day today, we've been looking backwards at what happened to the educational system in America at the hands of the progressive left. But now we've been kind of taking a turn the last couple segments and looking more forward. Here is the conclusion of the interview with Christopher Rufo and Hugh Hewitt.
2 points: physical courage and forward-thinking politics. I know you're in the new college board. I'm not sure it was you, but there came a moment when an old guard tried to shut down a meeting. I think it may be the most important turning point I've seen videographed. Where there someone is, was it you? Were they screaming at you, or were they screaming at somebody else to shut down? It was you.
It was
and
me.
They were demanding you shut down a meeting. You did not lose your temper, and you stood on your authority and said, "We are going on with the meeting. We will not be intimidated." It's very hard to do that in CHAZ, but in a room full of angry teachers, it's very easy to do. It's not easy to do. I mean, you're not going to get shot by someone. Can you tell people what happened and why that was important and what that is a model of doing, which is using the authority with which you are properly vested to accomplish the mission with which you have been charged?
Yeah. So in January, I was appointed along with a number of other trustees, along with another number of other conservative intellectuals and other figures as a new board majority at the New College of Florida. New College of Florida is Florida's smallest public university. It was in a turmoil. It was in crisis. It had become a kind of far left activist ghetto within the Florida's public university system. It was the lowest performing public university. But rather than close it down, which many legislators had wanted to do, Governor DeSantis had a different strategy. He said, "Hey, wait a minute. I'm elected by the people. I get to appoint the board. Why don't we appoint a conservative board and then transform the institution into a classical liberal arts university, something along the lines of a Hillsdale, kind of public style Hillsdale, with a great books curriculum, etc." And so I went with a small team of people. After we were appointed, it was a big controversy in the media. And I went down there and I said, "Look, I'm going to talk to the faculty. I'm going to talk to the students. I'm going to hold a town hall on campus." Overnight, the night preceding it, someone had called in a death threat against a fellow trustee, and then, of course, by extension, against me. They mobilized 4 different police departments. They had bomb-sniffing dogs. It was kind of heavily fortified anticipation of this event. I show up on campus. People are at the doors, and the provost of the university confronts me, kind of wagging her finger in my face, and says, "We're shutting this event down. It's not safe for campus. You're putting everyone in danger. You can't speak here." And then I tell her very calmly, but very confidently, I said, "Hey, look, I'm the duly appointed board. We have a quorum. We have the board members here. We have a right to speak on this campus. We're the ultimate authority. And I know that you're the provost. I know because the president is gone, you're acting as president. But if you look at the organizational chart, I'm above you. And so I'm the boss. I'm making a decision. I'm instructing the police to open the doors and let people in for this conversation." And so it was a tense moment, but I overruled her. I overruled the president. And we went on with the conversation, which was peaceful, and it was a good exchange of ideas. But then what we did is actually very instructive. And I'll give you the kind of 30-second overview of what we've done in the subsequent 6 months. We fired the president. We pushed out the provost who had been trying to shut down the speech. We've replaced many of the administrators. We abolished the DEI department. We fired the DEI director. We've recruited the largest class of incoming students in the college's history. We've secured the largest budget in the college's history, stabilizing the finances. We've appointed a great new president, Richard Corcoran, who's been leading the college on this tremendous effort. And then another thing that's very controversial, we have facilitated the exit of about a quarter of the faculty. And so all of the most kind of radical, hostile, far-left ideologues on the faculty, through a process of persuasion and self-selection, have actually been kind of shown the door. And this is what it's going to take to actually recapture these institutions and make them reflect not the priorities of the tenured radicals and political activists, but actually reflect the values of the public who elects the legislators and actually who pays the bills at these public universities.
So the last 7 minutes I've gotten, you've been very generous with your time, Christopher Rufo. Congratulations again on America's cultural revolution. I want to talk about the campaign ahead. I am in Switzerland, Everyone is welcome here. The former president's been here. Governor DeSantis has been here, down to Doug Burgum and the guy whose name I can't remember, the mayor of Miami, Suarez, and Will Hurd. They're all welcome here. That Switzerland, people can come and talk. But what do you want them asked when they're on the debate stage? To focus the public on the battle. There are two battles. One is with communist China, and that's a foreign threat. That's abroad. And the national security conservatives are easy to rally and they're easy to get behind defense spending. But the cultural war has stood for so much for so long that it's very fun. It ought to be called the education war. That's what I think. We won the life issue. It's over. It's up to states now. But what ought they to be asked about education in America? And how would you phrase it so that we get people talking about it in the right way? Because those are big audiences. That's when people can talk about what they will do. And parents want this. They don't want illiterate children with no skill sets who babble in jargon. They want kids who can do STEM. They need computers. They got to be able to know where they came from. They've got to understand that we're in a republic, that we have a constitution and a body of law. How do you frame that on a debate stage, Christopher Rufo?
Well, it's important because of course, K through 12 education is mostly the purview of the states and local jurisdictions. And so presidents who kind of lay out K through 12 education policy be a little skeptical. But what I would do is I would come up with very specific, concrete examples to say, for example, that, K through 12 students in these schools, you can draw from my reporting, are being segregated by race. They're being scapegoated for their ancestry. And they're being taught that the United States is fundamentally racist and that all, white Americans are oppressors. What are you going to do to stop it? Or you could say something like, the federal government is the largest subsidizer of universities in the United States. We're pouring, hundreds of billions of dollars into subsidies for our universities. And the departments are 10 to 1, 20 to 1, 50 to 1, 100 to 1 or more, left-wing versus conservative. You have a quarter of university professors self-identifying in the social sciences as Marxists and radicals and revolutionaries in some cases. Why are conservative taxpayers and conservative legislators subsidizing institutions that have been totally captured by our opponents? And in a sense, what are you going to do to stop that and reverse it? And so I would come up with these specific facts that illustrate the problem and then put them on the defensive, not in the frame of general culture war. They can all say CRT is bad, but actually get them into the nitty gritty of what will you do to stop it? How will you use the Justice Department? How will you reform student loans? How will you use the Department of Education to crack down? Are you going to remove, file lawsuits against these schools? And so I think the more specific you can be, pinning these guys down on the problems, you're going to see a very huge divergence between those who are serious and who've thought about these issues and those who are mere dilettantes kind of repeating the tired slogans of the past.
Okay, I want to close with the book, America's Cultural Revolution. It's selling despite the left, right? You note that legacy media, or what I call Manhattan Beltway media elites, have been captured by the same kind of mindless, they can't articulate what they believe, but they believe it and it comes through in their questions. Is legacy media paying any attention to your book? Are they treating it the way that they would treat a book by one of their Piketty? Piketty writes a book on Marxism that nobody buys, and he's everywhere on media. Chris Rufo's book is flying off the shelves. Are you getting any attention from and serious conversation with PBS, NPR, and all the other legacy media giants?
Yeah, not a ton, of course. Haven't been invited on many of those programs. Although I've, my PR team and the publisher HarperCollins has pitched it to all those programs. But there is a bit of an opening, though. I've done some kind of left-wing podcasts. I've done some left-wing publication interviews within the political sphere. It's been covered in The Economist, which is not exactly a kind of social conservative magazine by this point. It got a great review in The Economist. You've published a very kind and nice column in the Washington Post. And actually, most surprising to me is that they let it on the New York Times bestseller list. I think that they couldn't really deny it because it's been doing so well in the marketplace. But actually, I wrote an op-ed for the New York Times as a guest contributor. and they published it, which I thought was quite stunning. And so I think that there is maybe an opening. While the legacy media really tightened up in 2020, wouldn't engage in any kind of discussion or debate. I think because we've won on CRT, we're winning on gender, we're pressuring them on school choice and other policies. I think, and look, this has been my theory all along. I go to war. I mean, I really, truly, in a kind-hearted way and an optimistic way, I go to war with these folks. I do the reporting. I put pressure on them. I work with policymakers. I get policies passed. I never back down. And in my view, the way to get the legacy media engaged is not to ask their permission, but to force them to engage. And so
on that
I
point,
think we've done that
on that point, NPR is paid for, is state subsidized. Now they raise their own money, and they always say it's only 3 or 5. But has NPR featured you? Have you been on Fresh Air or on the Book Show or anything like that?
No, I have not. Yeah.
Steve Inskeep has. I'm just stunned. How about PBS? Again, state subsidized.
No, zero.
All right, keep fighting. I want to honor your commitment. America's Cultural Revolution. Congratulations, Chris Rufo. Keep fighting. I look forward to meeting you in person sometime. I appreciated the time this morning.
That's great. Thanks, you. Great to be with you.
Thank you.
So that concludes the interview with Hugh and Christopher Rufo. Now, here's the thing. Here's how you can help out. Here's how you can join that war. Pick up a copy of that book. I mean, it truly is the manual of the subject matter that is going to be one of the key issue sets in the election next year. It just is. Economics is, but education is going to be one of the main drivers of the presidential races all the way down to state and local levels. This book will help you get smart on the issue. You'll be able to answer the questions of how we got to where we're at, and it will also look forward to actual solutions. This is how you can help out. This is how you can take part in the cultural revolution that is regaining control of the education system. Pick up a copy of America's Cultural Revolution by Christopher Rufo. Duane Patterson in for Hugh Hewitt. We will be back right after the break. Stick around. The Hugh Hewitt Show is now available on TV. Go to salemnewschannel.com or download the app. You can also watch on Roku and Fire Stick. Salem News Channel, the antidote to the mainstream media. Welcome back, America. Home stretch of the Hugh Hewitt Show. Duane Patterson in for Hugh. He will be back tomorrow. Great interview with Christopher Rufo. And coming up after the top of the hour here, when the Hugh Hewitt Show ends, I'm going to jump on to the Universe, and we will have all the political news from over the weekend. All the clips you need to know from the Sunday shows will be on the Grand Old Pod, which is heard exclusively in the Universe for subscribers. The Grand Old Pod is the podcast for Republicans, by Republicans, about Republicans, and it features, what do we have today? John Lauro, the former president's lawyer, did the full Ginsburg, so I've got every Sunday show represented with him. Tim Scott, Asa Hutchinson, a couple of Mike Pence clips, Chris Christie, Doug Burgum, and a really terrific Ron DeSantis cut straight ahead in the Grand Old Pod. Hope you join us for that over at Huniverse.com. I want to conclude by reading the tail end of this New York Times expose of how the CCP has co-opted the American Progressive Movement through Neville Roy Singham and his wife, actually. Jody Evans, who he married in 2017, she's the co-founder of Code Pink. And the two of them are like the power couple in today's American Progressive Movement. Let me read you the tail end of this story. Ms. Evans, 68, was once a Democratic insider who managed the 1992 presidential campaign of then California Governor Jerry Brown. After the 2001 terrorist attack, she reinvented herself as an activist. She became known for pink peace sign earrings and sit-ins that ended with her arrest. She helped form Code Pink to protest the looming war in Iraq. The group became notorious for disrupting Capitol Hill hearings. Ms. Evans has organized around progressive causes like climate change, gender, and racism. And until a few years ago, she readily criticized China's authoritarian government. But that was back in 2015. She got married to Mr. Singham in 2017. Her views on China changed. She has organized around progressive, we demand China stop brutal repression of their women's human rights defenders, she wrote on Twitter in 2015. She later posted on Instagram a photo with the Chinese dissident Ai Weiwei. Since 2017, about a quarter of Code Pink's donations, or more than 1.4 million, have come from two groups linked to Mr. Singham, a nonprofit records show. The first was one of the UPS store nonprofits. The second was a charity that Goldman Sachs offers as a conduit for clients' giving, and that Mr. Singham had used in the past. Ms. Evans now stridently supports China. She casts it as a defender of the oppressed and a model for economic growth without slavery or war. Quote, "If the U.S. crushes China," she said in 2021, "it would cut off hope for the human race and life on Earth." She describes the Uyghurs as terrorists and defends their mass detention. "We have to do something," she said in 2021. In a recent YouTube video chat, she was asked if she had anything negative to say about China. "I can't, for the life of me, think of anything," she responded. She ultimately did have one complaint. She had trouble using China's phone-based payment apps. Ms. Evans declined to answer questions about funding from her husband, but said Code Pink had never taken any money from any government. Few on the American political left would discuss the couple publicly, fearing lawsuits or harassment. Others said that criticism would undermine progressive causes. But Howie Hawkins, the 2020 Green Party presidential nominee, said he had soured on Code Pink and others in the Singham network that presented themselves as pro-labor but supported governments that suppress workers. To defend that or excuse that really pushes them outside what the left ought to be, he said. Code Pink is not alone among left-wing groups in raising concerns about anti-Asian discrimination and tensions between Beijing and Washington. But Code Pink goes further. Defending the Chinese government's policies in a 2021 video, a staff member compared Hong Kong's pro-democracy demonstrators to the rioters who stormed the Capitol on January 6th that year. In June, Code Pink activists visited staff members on the House Select Committee on China unannounced. In the office of Representative Seth Moulton, Democrat of Massachusetts, activists denied evidence of forced labor in Xinjiang and said the congressman should visit and see how happy people were there, according to an aide. The happy Uyghurs. They are capitalizing on very legitimate concerns in order to push this pro-authoritarian narrative, said Brian Ho, a editor with New Bloom, a progressive Taiwanese news site, said. And their ideas end up circulating in a way that affects mainstream discourse. Just last month, Mr. Singham attended a Chinese Communist Party propaganda forum. In a photo taken during a breakout session on how to promote the party abroad, Mr. Singham is seen jotting in a notebook adorned with a red hammer and a sickle. That's the American progressive movement, as espoused in the New York Times today. It's stunning. Lots ahead coming up in the podcast, The Grand Old Pod. Stick around for that. Until then, Duane Patterson in for Hugh Hewitt. Hugh's back tomorrow with a brand new edition of The Hugh Hewitt Show. Thanks for listening, everybody. Have a great day. Portions of The Hugh Hewitt Show are brought to you by Food for the Poor.